dash and valor wove a legend as glorious as the nation they fought so hard to build and protect. Their very name has come to mean rescue at the last desperate moment. It's a name that still rings out down the years as clear, golden, and thrilling as a bugle sounding the charge. The United States Horse Cavalry.
The history books tell us that the stirring saga of the United States Horse Cavalry that began on December 12, 1776, ended after World War II. In truth, the horse soldier rides on forever, having fought his way to a special place in the national spirit. The columns of cavalry we see riding in the mists of memory are sometimes blue, sometimes gray, sometimes dressed in khaki or buckskin. But always, they are at the fighting edge of turbulent growth and dreadful war. This is the magnificent, tragic, heroic, unvarnished history of the United States Horse Cavalry. A legend that charges forward, bright and eternal.
On June 9th, 1863, 20,000 of the most heroic cavalrymen ever to sit a horse fought the greatest mounted engagement in the history of the Western Hemisphere. The Battle of Brandy Station in the American Civil War was at once the finest and saddest hour of the United States Horse Cavalry. On the one hand, it exhibited the best efforts of the brilliant tacticians and valorous mounted soldiers of both sides. On the other hand, it was brother against brother. For every American trooper who knew the surge of victory in the savage fighting, another American felt the pain of defeat. The South still held the field after that narrowly decided fray, but courage was the winner on both sides in this epic of Union and Confederate cavalry. The men who fought that bloody day in Virginia were part of an endless line that rode under the cavalry guidons long before them and long after. Casimir Pulaski, the first commander of American cavalry, fought with a reckless disregard for odds, claiming, "First we beat the enemy, then we count him." General George Washington raised 4 regiments of dragoons for his army. Although valuable as mounted infantry, they were not trained for all cavalry missions. In the Revolutionary War, America found its first cavalry giants in men like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox.
The Hollywood Cavalry I was part of was often as mythical as those yellow scarves that no real trooper ever wore. It's time to get at the true cavalry. As the westward expansion began, the fierce Great Plains Indian tribes began to raid the early settlers along the wagon routes.
On March 2nd, 1833, Congress created the 1st Dragoons, and America at last had its first regular cavalry regiment. Its commander, Henry L. Dodge, was soon succeeded by the forceful Stephen Watts Kearny, who left his mark on the entire West. In 1836, the formidable Seminole Indian chief Osceola led his tribe to war in Florida. The 2nd Dragoons were formed to oppose him in a fierce, costly conflict that lasted until 1842. As the United States moved to annex Texas in 1846, a savage war with Mexico brought the cavalry of age. That same year, a new regiment of mounted riflemen was added. At Resaca de la Palma, the U.S. cavalry fought a foreign enemy for the first time. Later at Buena Vista, nearly 400 American horsemen beat off 5,000 Mexican lancers. But it was Stephen Kearny's horse soldiers far from the war in Mexico who forever changed the American continent. The nearly 400 troopers of his so-called Army of the West made marathon, disease-plagued marches westward. Their mission? To help consolidate the conquest of territory that would one day include all of California, Nevada, and Utah, and parts of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming, expanding the area of the U.S. by fully 1/3. By the mid-1850s, it was clear that the cavalry's strength was not sufficient to deal with the increasing attacks of highly mobile Indians against encroaching settlers in the vastly expanded western territories. The government in Washington responded by authorizing 2 new cavalry regiments, the 1st and 2nd. The 3rd Cavalry was formed 6 years later.
In April 1861, the fraying fabric of the American Union tore wide open. 11 southern states were soon engaged in a pitiless war with a federal government determined to reclaim them by arms.
The defecting states included the heartland of the horsemen. Here, men were nurtured in the tradition of bold and aggressive riding. To the North's dismay, some of the best of the young, dashing U.S. cavalry leadership, blooded in the Mexican and Indian wars, gave their allegiance to the home states of the Confederate cause. At first, all the advantage went to the Confederate cavalry. Many of the Southern horsemen brought their own well-trained horses into the Confederate Army. The rebels quickly found use for their cavalry in daring surprise attacks. The cavalryman's cavalryman was 28-year-old Confederate General James Ewell Brown Stuart, Jeb to friend and foe alike. Stuart created a cavalry that was to rewrite the textbooks on cavalry tactics. They would apply from the Civil War to the great battlefields of Europe. Jeb Stuart set forth what was to be the peculiarly American concept of cavalry. This was his doctrine.
Mobility superior to that of the enemy enables the force to deliver or decline battle at will, to concentrate with such speed upon a threatened point that superiority attained can seldom be more than temporary.
In 1862, Jeb Stuart led 2,500 horsemen of the Army of North Virginia completely around the confused Union force that George McClellan had brought to the doorstep of Richmond. Stuart's cavalry ravaged communications, captured prisoners and material, and generally raised 10 kinds of hell. Throughout the war, a colorful group of Southern cavalry commanders would often rout superior numbers of their former comrades in the Union Army. General Nathan Bedford Forrest was as brilliant with his Confederate cavalry as he was colorful with his language. His ungrammatical "get there firstest with the mostest" remains a deathless cavalry dictum. In the same aggressive mold as Forrest was John Hunt Morgan. While riding with Forrest after Shiloh, their cavalry ran into a Union ambush. Undaunted, they charged the Federals over murderous footing and almost captured General Sherman in the doing. Other famous Southern cavalrymen included Wade Hampton, Harry Gilmore, John Singleton Mosby, and Fighting Joe Wheeler. Wheeler was so highly regarded as a Confederate cavalry leader that he was later welcomed back into the U.S. Army to command major forces in the Spanish-American War. The Southern cavalry victories would soon end as the weight, wealth, and hard-won experience of the Union forces began to take hold. In 1861, mounted units of the U.S. Army that had been manning the western outposts against the Indians were called east and redesignated the 1st through 6th Cavalry Regiments. It would take them the better part of 2 years to come up to speed in the Civil War. While Confederate cavalrymen were depending on their own personal mounts, the Union was creating an immensely larger and every bit as tough cavalry force from the 6 regiments on hand. As the bloody Civil War raged on, the Union cavalry continued to grow. Numbering barely 5,000 men in 1861, the Federal cavalry ranks increased to 80,000 troopers by the war's end. Out of its regular cavalry force, the Union developed its own daring mounted raiders. By 1869, one of them, Colonel Benjamin Grierson, had cut a wide swath from Tennessee through Mississippi down to Baton Rouge. At the same time, Grierson's fellow horse soldiers, men like James Wilson, Judson Kilpatrick, and George Armstrong Custer, vied for glory in large-scale cavalry actions that tore through the South. The turning point of the Northern campaigning came in 1864 when Abraham Lincoln, tired of prolonged failure to secure the Shenandoah Valley from the marauding rebel cavalry, met with General Grant to agree on the selection of an officer to lead cavalry forces of the Army of the Potomac. Their choice? Philip Sheridan, a short, homely, bandy-legged general who would finally employ the Union cavalry as it was meant to be used. Now the Union riders were sufficiently powerful to keep the Confederate raiders from devastating the Union lines of communication. Now the Union cavalry was always ready to plug a gap in the Union line or punch a hole into the enemy's defense. The brilliant actions of the Federal horsemen hastened the end of the Civil War.
The United States Cavalry versus the American Indians has been the subject of more heat than light. Truth was, the horse soldier was neither the heroic knight of early depictions nor a degraded harasser of noble savages, nor was the battle always as one-sided as supposed.
In the late 1800s, there were nearly 100 major Indian tribes, totaling some 300,000 people, spread over 1 million square miles of U.S. territory. The settlers of this sprawling area had to be protected by military forces that included only 5,000 cavalrymen. For the fiercest Indian tribes, wars had been a never-ending part of life. Most Indians were not farmers or builders, and many made a practice of raiding other tribes. Apache is the Pima word for enemy. War could mean power, and many tribes looked upon battle as natural. The 1880s alone had 22 distinct Indian wars. Attacks on wagon trains, settlements, and U.S. cavalrymen took thousands of lives. U.S. cavalry forts were spread thinly across the plains, committed to protecting the westward migration of the settlers. They faced a remarkable foe. General George Crook, an infantry officer who was a keen student of cavalry support, described the typical Sioux warrior as A cavalry soldier, from the moment he has intelligence enough to ride a horse or fire a gun, he is to be dreaded more than any European cavalryman.
Cavalry and Indian horses were vastly different animals for vastly different needs.
The Indian horse was largely descended from those brought by the Spanish conquistadores. They were of African barb and Arabian strains that adapted well to harsh, dry climates. The Indian ponies, inclined to be small and durable, were able to thrive without much basic care or feeding beyond what they grazed. Cavalry horses, by contrast, had to be capable of bearing loads over great distances. They were stronger and heavier than the Indian ponies, standing at least 15 hands high. To meet cavalry demands, they needed to be groomed, shod, and given veterinarian attention. Here is a typical trooper's McClellan saddle setup in the 1870s and 80s. On the pommel went an overcoat, a poncho, and grain bag. The cantle held a bedroll consisting of a blanket, extra clothing, tent pole and pins, and rope inside a shelter half. A picket pin and lariat was attached to the saddle ring. The canteen was located on the right side. A sling held a carbine in a socket or boot, also on the right side. The saber, so rich in the imagination of cavalry battle, was obsolete by the end of the Civil War. It was of little use against darting, charging Indian warriors and was usually left behind. Yet its use was taught exhaustively for almost as long as there was a cavalry. Inevitably, crossed sabers became the cavalry insignia. The revolver was the cavalryman's most decisive mounted weapon. It was in general use well before repeating rifles. Percussion cap models were laborious to load with paper cartridges and ball, but then were ready with 6 fast shots. Loaded extra cylinders were sometimes carried. The revolver frustrated the Indians' favored tactic of drawing fire and then rushing in during the reloading process. The introduction of metallic cartridges with powder charge, percussion device, and bullet contained in one fast-loading, easy-to-carry unit made the cavalryman's revolver even more efficient and deadly in battle. The big advance in carbines would come with early breech loaders like the Burnside. Although they at first held but a single shot, a skilled cavalryman could load, aim, and fire a round every 10 seconds or so, a dizzying rate when compared to the old muzzle loaders. Later, there would be repeaters like the Spencer that fed 7 cartridges through a buttstock magazine. Accuracy from the saddle was just about impossible, and most fighting was done dismounted. A basic tactic had the troopers walking forward in a line, loading and firing as they went. 1 man in 4 was designated a horse holder, thereby reducing the available firepower by 25%. The basics of cavalry movement were taught until they were second nature. The mounted column could wheel, turn, form in a line, or form a skirmish line. All this for use against an Indian foe who had no basic commands beyond ride and attack. A thundering regiment with every man mounted on a half-ton of superbly trained horseflesh was as terrifying a thing as a warrior ever had to face, and as magnificent a spectacle as battle ever offered. The bugle was an important means of communicating commands, its piercing notes audible above hoofbeats and battle din beyond any human voice. The most common bugle call was stable call, which became a famous cavalry ditty. It went, "Come get to the stable as fast as you're able. Water your horses and give 'em some corn. For if you don't do it, the colonel will know it, and then you will rue it as sure as you're born."
The withdrawal of the U.S. Cavalry from the western forts for Civil War service in the East had meant the abandonment of hard-won gains against the hostile Indian tribes. The Arizonian expressed the local hysteria. Since the removal of the garrison troops, the chances against life have reached the maximum height. Within 6 months, 9/10 of the male population has been killed off, and every ranch, farm, and mine in the county has been abandoned in consequence.
In Minnesota and the Dakota Territory, Little Crow's Sioux warriors had massacred almost 1,000 settlers in 1862. The Utes had taken to the attack in Idaho, while the Navajos raided across New Mexico. Apaches bloodied Arizona, and the Comanches prowled Texas to the very outskirts of San Antonio. The U.S. Cavalry was about to launch a 20-year war against the Indians, some of whom had been called the finest light cavalry in the world. Behind it all was the dislocation of a great and proud people. Corruption and ineptitude in the Department of the Interior's Indian Bureau had left their mark as the Indian nations sought to break free of unbearable living conditions. Treaty terms were endlessly agreed to, then disregarded by all concerned. Great warriors whose names still resound would lead the battles. Cochise, Roman Nose, Santana, Red Cloud, and Geronimo. Against them would stand resolute cavalry leaders tested in both the Civil War and Indian Wars. Men like Sheridan, Crook, and Custer. Their operating territory, designated the Division of the Missouri, was huge, stretching from the Canadian to the Mexican borders and from Chicago through Colorado. To patrol this vastness, Phil Sheridan, now in command, was able to muster just one cavalryman for every 750 square miles in the north and one for every 120 square miles in the south. What kind of men volunteered to endure the hideous privations and dangers of those cavalry regiments on the plains? The average age was 23. About half the troopers were immigrants. At a time when a week's work might bring a grocery store clerk $2, the $13 a month's pay for a private was not at all bad. Basic issue was a dark blue wool blouse, 2 pairs of sky blue trousers, 2 gray or dark blue flannel shirts, 2 suits of underwear, a caped overcoat, a forage cap, and boots called brogans. Shoes were so crude that left was almost indistinguishable from right. Army food was bad enough for scurvy to be a problem, and soldiers often bought food outside the post or grew their own vegetables. In 1890, 25-year-old Civil War hardtack was still being issued. Only 1 trooper in 100 made 30 years. Generally, after 10 or 15, a man's health was likely to be broken.
A cavalryman's allegiance went first to his company. He was likely to spend his entire Army career among the same 60 men. An outfit usually didn't associate with another. When one company was inactivated, they wrote a heartbroken letter to their captain.
We might be separated, but the comradeship among us will not cease. We dread the day we'll have to leave our quarters where we have lived in harmony for so long. Our record as a model troop will always remain, and the members will hold on to it.
Among enlisted men, nicknames were so common that a trooper might not know the given name of a single man in his company. But the unbreakable bond formed between the men on the isolated frontier both protected the integrity of the unit in battle and served as a shield against the loneliness and hardships of Army life in the West. With promotions agonizingly slow, a captain, referred to as the old man, might indeed be in his 50s. Officers were mostly unapproachable. First sergeants virtually ran the units. When a sergeant's pay cut was proposed, one colonel offered to make up the loss from his own pocket. Post-medical care was sketchy at best. In the field, it was pathetic. One trooper told of his sergeant disinfecting his leg wound by spitting the nicotine from a chew of tobacco into it. He said, "I never went to a doctor." Wives on posts were rare. Higher ranks could bump those of lower rank out of their quarters. An enlisted man's permission to marry might hinge on a company's need for a laundress. Post life was either freezing cold or blazing hot, and well supplied with scorpions, snakes, centipedes, mosquitoes, and worse. The beauties of nature in the West never quite equaled its perils. Nighttime attacks by prowling wolves were not unknown. As the nation moved westward, the vigorous discipline and constant vigilance that molded the U.S. Cavalry would prove its value. By the close of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln had created 6 immense new territories: Colorado, Nevada, Arizona, Idaho, Montana, and Dakota. The cavalry was part of a vastly shrunken army that had to occupy the South and reestablish the safety of the western settlements. In 1866, the Army organized 4 new cavalry regiments: the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th. The 9th and 10th were African-American regiments, dubbed Buffalo Soldiers by the Indians. Over the years, they would serve with valor and distinction. In 1866, Captain William J. Fetterman and 80 troopers were ambushed almost in sight of Fort Kearny and wiped out. The Sioux warriors gained control of the Bozeman Trail and would soon bring the Union Pacific Railroad under attack. In 1867, Alfred J. Barnitz joined the 7th Cavalry as an officer. He survived years of pitched battles that were vividly described in his letters. Of the Sioux, he wrote, "All were most admirably mounted and armed. Many had repeating rifles or carbines, and every Sioux appeared to have at least one revolver in addition to his powerful bow and arrows. Some of the latter were shot with such force as to pierce the beechwood of our saddle trees and 2 thicknesses of rawhide covering." Civil War hero George Armstrong Custer and his 7th Cavalry were Phil Sheridan's cutting edge. The 7th had one of the highest desertion rates in the Army, and Custer was little admired. Alfred Barnitz said of him, "General Custer is very injudicious in his administrations and spares no effort to render himself generally obnoxious. I have lost the little confidence I had in him as an officer and all admiration for his character as a man. Better liked and respected was General George Crook. The Civil War hero was a paradox. While his tactics and tenacity did much to defeat the Indians, he admired them, spoke fluent Apache, and would fight for their rights when the Indian Wars ended. Taking time to learn the ways of the tribes, Crook recruited hundreds of Indian scouts for his army. He had divined that fighting was their honor, often more important than tribal loyalty. As uncanny trackers, these Indians gave invaluable service to Crook's cavalry. Realizing that the weakness of his Indian enemies was an inability to move their villages freely in winter, Crook undertook winter campaigns, using pack mules to increase his mobility. Again and again, his cavalrymen stalked and attacked the Indian camps. Dawn raids were the most effective, since the Indians seldom posted sentries. The Indian versus cavalry battle names ring down through the ages. Remolina, McClellan's Creek, Tule Canyon, Palo Duro, Crazy Woman Fork, Bear Paw Mountain, the Washita. And there was Beecher's Island, where a beleaguered band of cavalry was besieged by 600 Sioux, Cheyenne, and Northern Arapaho. The gallant troopers defended their position for 9 desperate days. The fearsome Cheyenne chief Roman Nose died in the action as the African-American troopers of the 10th Cavalry rode to the rescue.
All of the great battles fought in the Sea of Grass pale in the imagination alongside one that took place near Montana's Little Bighorn River on June 26, 1876.
The events leading to the undoing of General Custer's command began with a larger battle fought near the Rosebud River. With Generals Gibbon and Terry advancing on his flanks, General Crook moved up to support the 7th Cavalry. The Indians under Crazy Horse raced to the attack, and Crook's troopers were sent limping away. Disastrously, Custer split off some 140 troopers to Major Reno and another 125 to Captain Benteen. And he challenged 1,500 warriors camped across a 4-foot-deep creek. What came to be known as Custer's Last Stand would become one of the most frequently and fancifully painted and filmed battles in history. The final Indian assault at the Little Bighorn River brought a fatal storm of arrows and a hail of deadly rifle fire, much of it from repeating weapons, to overwhelm the gallant 7th Cavalry with its single-shot Springfields. Custer and members of the 5 companies under his command died to the last man. In all, 267 troopers of the 7th Cavalry lost their lives on that bitterest day in cavalry history. The only survivor of Custer's command, Captain Miles Keogh's horse, Comanche, would remain a pampered part of the 7th Cavalry for many years. General Nelson A. Miles led the final part of the 1876 campaign that drove the Indians north and broke their war power for good. The Indians did not go easily. The long, peaceful Nez Perces under Chief Joseph turned against the cavalry. At Whitebird Canyon, they killed 69 troopers, using only bows and arrows. But, worn down to 87 warriors, Chief Joseph surrendered with the words, "Hear me, my chiefs, my heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." General Miles called the Apache leader Geronimo the worst Indian that ever lived. In one raid, accompanied by only 11 braves, Geronimo killed 38 people and stole 250 horses. In the end, it took 5,000 troops and an invasion of Mexico to catch him for good. Geronimo lived to join the Dutch Reformed Church, sell autographs at the St. Louis World's Fair, and ride in Teddy Roosevelt's inauguration parade. In 1890, at South Dakota's Wounded Knee Creek, in what is considered the last significant battle between the U.S. cavalry and the Indians, a sad, confused massacre took the lives of 300 Indians and 25 cavalry troopers. The long agony of the Indian Wars was ending. The agony of Indian subjugation was about to begin. The Spanish-American War of 1898 was the first conflict to take the United States cavalry across the seas. Its leadership was a virtual class reunion of cavalry veterans of the Indian and Civil Wars. Thanks to the lurid, often inaccurate reporting of the newspapers, the war's most famous unit was the 1st Volunteer Cavalry, the Rough Riders. While Colonel Leonard Wood was their actual commander, Teddy Roosevelt, his second-in-command, stole the show. The Rough Riders were made up of everything from Western cowboys to Eastern polo players. As for mounted action, there was none. Roosevelt and his Rough Riders did not take their horses to Cuba. But fight they did as the 1st, 3rd, 6th, and 9th Cavalry regiments battled their way up a height called Kettle Hill. From there, they charged up San Juan Hill with another cavalry unit, the 10th, making the decisive move. Troopers of the 10th, the famed Buffalo Soldiers, earned a stunning 5 Medals of Honor in the historic action. But it was Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders who rode in all the welcome home parades, mounted on horses they had picked up at Montauk Point, Long Island, on their return from Cuba. In 1900, cavalry leaders like General Henry W. Lawton led 8 regiments through the Philippine jungle in pursuit of guerrilla leader Emilio Aguinaldo. The fighting would lead to the creation of 5 new cavalry regiments, the 11th through the 15th in 1901. When Chinese forces threatened the foreign enclave at Peking in the 1900 Boxer Rebellion, 2 squadrons of the 6th U.S. Cavalry helped an international force win the day.
The last major campaign of the United States Cavalry was not a war at all. It was a punitive action against a foe who emulated the great Indian tribes for bold, headlong dash, skilled and tenacious fighting, and inspired leadership.
With the abdication of President Porfirio Diaz, Mexico descended into anarchy. The line between bandit and patriot became very fine. The Mexican revolutionary who would most wildly bedevil the U.S. cavalry was Pancho Villa. In 1916, Villa's horsemen suddenly crossed into the United States and attacked Columbus, New Mexico. After surprised units of the 13th Cavalry repelled the incursion, a pursuit across the Mexican border was organized. The punitive expedition under the leadership of John J. Pershing was hindered by the implacable hostility of the Mexican government, which intervened militarily on the side of the Villistas. Eventually, the cavalry's numbers and mobility neutralized Villa's threat. In the early days of World War I, the use of European cavalry against entrenched infantry with machine guns proved disastrous. Of 10 new U.S. cavalry regiments authorized, only 2, the 16th and 17th, were activated. In Europe, the late arriving American Expeditionary Force limited its cavalry combat to just 1 unit, the 2nd Cavalry. The regiment was used mostly for transport, liaison, and reconnaissance. The 3rd, 6th, and 15th regiments were also in France, but saw no action.
Although there was still a bit of fighting to come, the U.S. Cavalry was beginning to ride into a long twilight.
The premier cavalry school of the world at Fort Riley, Kansas, was nearing the end of the trail. Forts Meyer, Bliss, Leavenworth, Oglethorpe, Robinson, Sheridan, Brown, and Knox, along with the Presidio of Monterey, were other cavalry training posts that would soon lose their cavalry roots. In 1933, the mechanization of cavalry units began. The 1st Cavalry Regiment was chosen to lead the change. The 13th Cavalry followed in 1936, the 2 regiments becoming the 7th Cavalry Brigade mechanized. By 1940, Germany's World War II blitzkrieg had shown the absolute dominance of tank forces. The valiant but doomed Polish cavalry, throwing itself against the German steel, was the last gasp of the horse soldier in strategic warfare. After Pearl Harbor, U.S. cavalry regiments were converted into horse mechanized units, in which one squadron was mechanized and the other horse. The horse squadron was transported on portees or trucks. These units were later reorganized into cavalry groups and reconnaissance units and served with the highest tradition of the horse cavalry. The 1st Cavalry Division was dismounted, trained, and fought as infantry. During World War II, in the Philippines and on other far-flung battlefields, U.S. cavalry units carried their illustrious names and battle traditions forward to victory. On June 30th, 1950, the cavalry branch became the armored branch, preserving the cavalry tradition of boldness and mobility. Armored cavalry and sky cavalry units, as they are called, have fought bravely and with honor wherever they were needed. Far more important than the old names, these units took with them the spirit of the U.S. Horse Cavalry, the heritage and the hell-for-leather dash that made the American horse soldier so formidable are the legacy of today's cavalry. Modern cavalry forces have added glowing pages to the history of American arms.
The new U.S. Cavalry will be welcomed warmly to Fiddler's Green. Let us tell you about Fiddler's Green.
When a cavalryman dies, he begins a long ride to his ultimate destination. About halfway along the road, he finds a broad meadow dotted with trees and crossed by many streams, a place known as Fiddler's Green. Nearby are camped all the dead cavalrymen with their tents, horses, picket lines, and campfires. Other branches of the service must march through without pause. Cavalrymen, though, are authorized to dismount, unsaddle, and stay forever in Fiddler's Green. Their canteens ever full to enjoy the companionship and reminiscences of old friends.
They aren't forgotten because they haven't died. They're living, right out there, Collingwood and the rest. They'll keep on living as long as the regiment lives. Their pay is $13 a month, their diet beans and hay. Maybe horse meat before this campaign is over. Fight over cards or rot-gut whiskey, but share the last drop in their canteens. Their faces may change, their names, but they're there. They're the regiment, the regular army.
Fiddler's Green, to all the gallant troopers who are camped there and those still to join them, to the men of the United States Cavalry.